they said, fix healthcare, you have to fix health, and to fix health, you have to fix income. And the top line recommendations included a basic income, right? So we now have this coming out of the kind of health conversation, and I think there was a lot. I would actually encourage folks interested in fisheries to read the Health Accord report, because it talks a lot about the legacy of the collapse of the cod fishery in the 90s, and how much that's impacted population health. And there's a really interesting story to be told there. So I'll stop there, Kristen. I think that's probably useful context for the room about maybe what we're talking about and some of the ways it's getting expressed right now, and how your work will fit in. So thanks for inviting me. I'm really excited to hear all about the case you folks are building. And over to you.
Great. So thank you, Josh. That was great. So our case I mentioned is around the case for basic income in the fisheries, including small scale and subsistence fisheries. And I think what our case is sort of really trying to address is thinking about how a basic income might contribute to sort of addressing precarity in the sector and contributing to socio and economic sustainability. So thinking about challenges like rising fishing costs, new entrants, seasonality, reliance on employment insurance systems. Where does basic income maybe fall in this kind of mix of different supports that may make fishing and for fish workers sort of more sustainable livelihoods. So our brief has 4 sort of sections, and if there are people that are really interested in reading it and want to offer comments, we're happy to share it. We're looking at labor and livelihoods, food systems, so also how supporting sustainable small-scale fisheries can also contribute to more resilient food systems. Climate resilience is another theme of the brief, so thinking about some of the links between income and climate security, and Indigenous self-determination, and considering the potential role of the basic income in Indigenous self-determination. And one of the members of our group who isn't here in person is with the Native Fishing Association. Andy Olson has been helping to draft that. So I should just mention in the room, we also have Rachel Waymer with Eco Trust, Barbara Neese from Memorial, Christine Knott with Memorial, Hannah Harrison, where's Hannah? Hannah Harrison, Dalhousie University, who are also part of this core team putting this brief together and are in the room here today. So I will now, I think we'll turn it over to the panelists who will be providing some kind of thoughts and perspectives on a basic income in the fisheries. I'll introduce them one at a time. So we have 5 panelists. So Ryan, hopefully you can hear me. So Ryan Lozon will be our first panelist. Ryan is the fisheries biologist and also runs the fisheries assessment program with the Chippewas of Nawash, unceded First Nation. So their traditional territory, the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation, is located around the Saugeen Peninsula on Lake Huron. And Ryan is responsible for supporting informed fisheries management decisions of the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation Joint Council through the collection of data on the commercial fishery. He's also very much involved in working with fish harvesters, engaged in questions of jurisdiction as well as traditional knowledge in the fishery. So Ryan, can you hear me? Can you confirm?
I can hear you. Yeah, can you hear me?
Okay. All right. So Ryan, I'll turn it over to you. Up to 10 minutes. Offer your thoughts and perspectives. And I know you can't see the people in the room, so I'm sorry you're looking at like a wall or something in the Delta Hotel. But I can stand here if you want to sort of see a person.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah, you sound great.
Okay. So thank you very much, Kristen and Barbara as well for having me today. I think you did a pretty good job of introducing me, Kristen, so thanks. I would just say that I've spent the last 14 years in my current position. I'm not a community member, but certainly the fishermen have never been shy about, telling me how it is and to be a fisherman and the struggles that they encounter. And I'm saying fishermen, but by fishermen, I would like to mention that I'm including fishermen and fisherwomen, as there is both men and women certainly involved in the fishery at the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation. So I think it's important when you're thinking about a basic income, to understand a little bit about the context. And for me in particular, I'm really speaking about where my knowledge comes from, and that's working with the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation. So that's really the context. And I'll start with a bit of a short story about the history to set that context. So the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation consists of two sister communities, the Chippewas of Nawash Unceded First Nation and the Chippewas of Saugeen within the Saugeen Ojibwe territory. And that territory stretches all the way from just south of Godrich in Lake Huron, around the Saugeen Peninsula, and all the way to close to the Nottawasaga River in Georgian Bay. And if you talk to some of the elders, they will tell you stories about the time when European settlers arrived, and the whitefish were so numerous that at that time they would say that you could walk on their backs. And as settlers first came into the territory, the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation actually leased out portions of the fishery at that time to those early settlers. Then along came Confederation and legislation such as the British North America Act that placed all inland fisheries under control under the federal settler government. And to this day, the Fisheries Act is a means of inserting control by the settler federal government. And through this legislation, the settler government attempts to limit the harvest of the sawn fishers and restrict the harvest to basically what has been described as little postage stamps around each First Nation. And the fishery that the sawn had been using since time immemorial was given by the settler government to some of the settlers that had settled in the area, and essentially First Nations were largely pushed out of the fishery. Saugeen continued to maintain that they never gave up the right to that fishery. And in 1993, Francis Najuan, otherwise known as Turtle, and Chief Howard Jones were charged with overfishing. It went to court, and the court reaffirmed that there was a right to a commercial fishery in what is known within the communities as the Jones-Najuan decision. So currently, the sawn is pretty much the only commercial fishery within the territory, aside from a few small areas at the edge of each kind of border to the traditional territory. And that brings us back to this idea about basic income. And I'm going to be looking at basic income from 4 different arguments: ecological, economic, cultural, and food security. And I will finish with a short story that illustrates the benefits of a basic income. So I will start with the ecological argument. So, as we hear from oral history, when settlers first arrived, the fish were so numerous that people could walk across their backs. We no longer see those kinds of numbers of fish. The fishery has greatly declined. We had years of overfishing by settlers. We had the almost complete extirpation of the native lake trout. And we have many other changes going on. You can look at climate change. You can look at introduced species like the dracetid mussels, which have vastly reduced the productivity of the lakes, meaning there's a lot less fish to go around. We have fish stocking to satisfy recreational sports interests. We have the development of the shorelines, which means that essentially the habitat for the young whitefish, for example, is being impacted. We have pollution, list goes on. Essentially, Canada's failure on the fisheries for the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation means there's a whole lot less fish. and it is much more difficult to be a fisher today. We'll then get into more of the economic arguments. So historically, fishing was the backbone of the economy for the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation, and it remains so to this day. In particular, at Nawash, where I work, it's much more remote and does not have a whole lot of other employment opportunities. Almost every family has someone that makes at least part of their income from fishing. Well, over 100 years of exclusion from the fishing economy, it's really hard to break into the long established markets, and the fishers often say that they get a lower price for their catch compared to those individuals that are not part of the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation that are also operating commercial fisheries outside of the territory. There really was a lack of fishing infrastructure, and that continues on to this day. Fish harvesters at Saugeen, they don't get paid if they are sick or if they are hurt. They do not get EI of any form if they're during the down season, like in the winter when the ice is too thick to get out. Essentially, they have to live off whatever they made during the fishing season, which can be very difficult. There is also a very high rate of poverty in both First Nations, unfortunately. An example is at the Chippewas of Nawash. It's in 2015, there was a 46% rate of employment, and the median income was just under $18,000. So very low employment rate and a very low amount of income that's coming in. So you can see how important that basic income is. There is also ongoing economic oppression, as well as you can make some other arguments there as well. For example, there is back in 1993 when we saw the results of that court case, there was a lot of opposition to the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation resuming commercial fishing, and that really continues on to this day. And what we see that manifest is a lot of acts of vandalism, people going out, cutting the gear of the fishers. They're not making a whole lot of money as it is, but there's ongoing loss of gear, boats being set free, vandalism, even physical violence at times. This stuff is all continuing on to this day, unfortunately. So the fish harvesters are struggling. There's not many fish, and there's a low price for their product. The basic income really could allow more time to develop local markets and that fishery infrastructure to help them basically just get a better price for their fish, do more value added, like fish smoking, those kinds of things. And really, the next thing I'd like to talk about is the cultural argument. So fish, for example, like whitefish, are part of the Dotem system that the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation operate under. And just kind of shows you that importance of the fish. And if you actually talk to some of the fish harvesters or the fishermen, fisherwomen, they will tell you that they see fish as family, essentially like a cousin. And that relationship to the fish is just so important that they're seen as a family member. And fish are a very important part of any feast that goes on in the community. Unfortunately, we're still seeing the effects of colonialism. For example, residential schools that had a big impact on that knowledge transfer from generation to generation. Currently, there's a lot of concern that we're hearing from the fish harvesters that there's just not a whole lot of young people coming into the fishery, and there's concern about losing that knowledge that's held within the community and not being able to pass that on to the younger generations. So moving on from the cultural aspects, I'll just get into the food security and sovereignty piece. So fish is an essential part of the diet at the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation. Just illustrates how important fishing is and the need to have sovereignty over that ability, I would say, to gather your own food, especially when you have low income and those kinds of things. This ability to go out and be able to get your own food is extremely important. As mentioned earlier in the introduction, we heard about how important fish is for people's health as well, having good quality food like fish. So I would like to finish off with a brief story that in my mind illustrates the importance of basic income and how basic income can really help everyone out. And it's a story from the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation and the Chippewas of Nawash in particular. And it happened not too many years ago when we saw the beginning of what was known at the time as the coronavirus. Later we started calling it COVID. There were many concerns about the impacts of this particular virus on people and people's health, people's income, all the rest of it. In particular, the fish harvesters were really hit hard when COVID came along because restaurants were shut down and most of the fish that is caught commercially from the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation ends up in the restaurant industry. So there weren't many people buying fish at that time because the restaurants were closed or only operating at checkout and so there really was an issue with fish harvesters not being able to sell their catch, not being able to get any form of income. So at the time, the leadership at the Chippewas of Nawash decided that they were going to step in and help the fish harvesters out by purchasing fish from the fish harvesters and then donating that fish to the local food banks within the First Nations, as well as some of the local food banks in the area and the friendship centers across Ontario. And really the idea was quite interesting because not only did it help the fish harvesters out by giving them a way to continue on their livelihood, but it also provided what was seen as a very healthy food for the people of the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation, especially when you're looking at that time period when there were concerns about food availability and making sure that everybody was as healthy as they could be. And fish within the community are seen as a very healthy food source. And not only that, but by keeping the fish within the community, it meant that there were less trips needed to be made between the Chippewas of Nawash and traveling to local towns and so on to get fish where there might be possible interactions where COVID could be brought back to the community. So it really was seen as a win-win. It was a win for the fishers, and it was a win for the communities that got the benefits of that fish. So I just thought that story really illustrated how this idea of basic income can really help more than just the fish harvesters, but also the communities as well. So ultimately, basic income is a potential step towards reconciliation with the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation. It encourages the sod fishing culture to thrive despite years of cultural oppression, economic segregation and discrimination, ecological degradation, and past and ongoing attempts to sever the relationship between the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation and the fish. Thanks everyone for listening.
Thank you, Ryan. That's great. So I think, I didn't mention this, but I think we'll keep questions until the end, if that's okay. We'll go through the panelists' presentations first. So our next speaker is Sonia Strobel. I think many of you probably saw Sonia this morning in the plenary. She is the co-founder and CEO of Skipper Auto, community-supported fishery based on Coast Salish territory in Vancouver, BC. She's worked in a variety of community-based organizations, nonprofits, as a high school teacher. She's an on advisory committees with Fisheries for Communities Coalition, Local Catch Network, Slowfish Canada. She's the president of the Friends of Granville Island Society, a fellow with the Royal Canadian Geographical Society, and has been a member of community supported agriculture programs since the early 1990s and kind of brought that to start Skipper Auto, CSF. So I'm going to just load your slides here and then.
Maybe if I stand over here, then they can hear me on that. And you can hear me. Does that work? Right on. Talk louder though. Okay. Put on my teacher voice. And so is there anybody here who wasn't here this morning when I was talking about Skipper Auto CSF? Or did everybody hear me talk about? Good. I won't spend any time talking about that, and I'll get right to my point. Or maybe, I don't know if you guys on the call, well, you know who we are. So Skipper Auto, really briefly, while they load up the slides. So Skipper Auto CSF, we started Skipper Auto 14 years ago. I married into a fishing family years before that, about 21 years ago. And we've been kind of reiterating and iterating on the CSF model for all that time. When we first started out, we were doing phone trees. Anybody here old enough to remember phone trees? Phone tree is when it's an old-fashioned thing where people had telephones in their houses and you'd phone one person and then they would have a list of 5 other people they were supposed to phone to say, hey, Otto's coming in. Otto's my father-in-law. Otto's coming in with fish tomorrow. So if you want to fish, come down to the dock. So like, that's what we did. And that was the genesis of it. So it's probably familiar to lots of harvesters, these innovative ways to try to sell your catch for a fair price. So anyway, here we are. When I was asked to speak on this panel, actually, I thought to myself, why did they want to hear me talk about this? No, I'm kidding. I thought basic income guarantee, I really enjoyed reading the paper on the topic. I think it's so, yeah, do you want to skip ahead to like slide 4? And so I thought, you know, at Skipper Auto, whenever we have to make a decision about whether something is relevant to us or a decision that we should say yes to or not, we have this thing that's our 5 key considerations that we use for decision making. If something relates to our objectives, our vision for a just and equitable seafood system. So those are, and if you want to click again, it'll come up. By the way, these are all our pictures from fishing in BC. I hope you appreciate a little bit of West Coast fishing pictures in the background here. So the 5 considerations are conservation, reconciliation and decolonization, protecting a fishing way of life in coastal communities, food security and food sovereignty, and then lastly, the kind of stability and resilience of our model. So if we have an opportunity that comes up, it's kind of like a grading rubric, you know, when you hand in a paper and, you know, it's a grading rubric. So you say, well, what would it look like to get 5 out of 5 on conservation and on decolonization and all these things? And if it scores high on all of them, then it's something we say, yes, this is important to Skipper Auto. We're going to do this. We're going to put our energy behind it. We're going to do it. So when I hold these up, and it's very much like what you were saying, which is, you know, Ryan started out by saying like, okay, what are the things that we consider here? It's the same kind of thing. How does a basic income guarantee connect to these 5 key considerations? And it really does. It does support and connect to all of them in the work that we do. And so it's really something that we want to, you know, throw our support behind because of the way that it impacts our fishing communities. Next slide. So these aren't super organized. These are just my thoughts as they came to me. In the paper, it talks about occupational pluralism, and I hadn't really heard that phrase before, but as soon as I read it, I knew what that meant. And I know that because if you want to click again, you'll see my title, Occupational Pluralism. So my husband is a salmon fisherman. He's on the fishing grounds right now. Our kids are with my parents because I'm here. You know, for those of you who have kids and fish, you understand that this is the juggle, right? That you're always doing. And my husband also has other decent paying work. So anytime he's going to fish, he has to make the decision about whether to not take that work, right? And he even had to take a bunch of unpaid days from his other job to get his boat ready, to get the gear on there. And I watch the anxiety for him every day that he's not working at his paying job. He's wringing his hands thinking, was this the right decision? You know, to take a day off of that work in the hopes, it's a gamble, it's a roll of the dice that I might make money fishing. And maybe I just shouldn't. Maybe I should throw in the towel and forget about fishing because I can make money. You know, it's like a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush, right? And so this is really how we're seeing, I think we're seeing the decimation of the fishing way of life in our coastal communities because people are being forced to make that decision every day, whether it's worth the gamble to persist in this way of life. And this is what harvesters you've heard talk about, this being on the water is like, it's in your blood, right? It's a way of life. It's the value is not in the dollars. The value is in this way of life, right? And we're driving people out of it, but having a basic income guarantee could mean that people don't have to make that. It's not that anxiety inducing a decision to be able to say, okay, you know what? I'm going to take a day off my other paying work to mend my nets and get out fishing. And I know I'm not going to lose completely. You want to hit the slide thingy 2 more times for me? 1, 2. The next thing I thought about was about EI and about fishing EI, because I have little things that pop up when you tap it. I'm a teacher. It's okay. I'll just keep talking. So fishing EI, why in my experience in British Columbia, employment insurance isn't good enough. And that's in British Columbia, the EI system is based on how much money you earn fishing. And that's not always something that's within your control. And so, you know, my husband will head out fishing and he could catch 300 fish or he could catch 2, right? And so whether he has a good year fishing, he's going to lose all his money because maybe the fish didn't come back, or maybe a recreational boater drove through his net on the first day and he did poorly fishing. And now he couldn't collect EI because he didn't earn enough fishing. So it's like a double whammy, right? And so, you know, I mentioned earlier this morning, we were talking about in BC last year when the minister announced on I think it was the 30th of June, right before the Canada Day long weekend, the closure of 60% of salmon fisheries quickly before everyone goes on vacation. And we were on our way to the fishing grounds. All the money was spent. And so not only could lots of harvesters now not fish, but they would also not collect EI that winter. And there was no compensation. There was no other compensation available for them. And so a basic income guarantee would put the responsibility of this back on the government. When you're going to make a decision like that to close the fisheries and take away the fishing opportunities, you are going to need to pay those harvesters a basic income because they took all the risk. They always take all the risk of the fishery. So I think, you know, I think it would really support EI. I think EI isn't enough. I wanted to mention that I'm often thinking about this concept of what's a living wage for BC fishers, not just what's the poverty line and how do we make sure that fishers are like at the poverty line, but how do we make sure that people are actually living a decent life, you know, that they can get shoes for their kids, they can get their teeth fixed, like what we go on a vacation, what would it look like to earn a living wage as a fisher, right? And so Megan Bailey, hi Megan, has been really helpful with helping us at Skipper Otto explore how would you define a living wage for fishermen. So in British Columbia, and I know internationally, there's the Living Wage for Families Coalition. And we've wanted to be on that list for a long time, but they don't know how to measure that for fishers. How would you measure what it means to make a living as a fisherman? Because nobody's ever explored that. So we've been trying to do that. Megan helped us to get an intern who unfortunately took a job, so we lost her. But this is something I just want to put it out there to all you research people in the room. This is a topic I'm really interested in. How would you define a living wage for harvesters? And then how would you determine if they're actually meeting a living wage? I think it's connected very much to this basic income guarantee, but you know, kind of beyond that, how do you measure it? And it's worth mentioning, I think, that protecting a fishing way of life, which is what we're talking about in a basic income guarantee situation, it really goes hand in hand with food security. And I think Ryan talked about this as well, that without small scale community-based fishers, like I was saying this morning, our food system is vulnerable. And we saw that in COVID, and Ryan was talking about that just now as well. If people can't earn a basic income in their communities, they move away, they work in the oil patch, they get jobs elsewhere. We lose the fabric of coastal communities and we lose our food systems. So I think there's a role for basic income to play in that. I have another slide, and I just want to talk a little bit, and Ryan, I think, did such a good job talking about, this is the slide, thank you. Talking about the implications of a basic income for First Nations harvesters. And this is something that I really thought of as well when I read the papers. So, and Andy Olson, who unfortunately can't be here, recently we were at a marine area planning meeting in Campbell River, actually. And he made this really good point, which I'll share with you here, which is that in British Columbia, we call it food and ceremonial, or FSC fisheries. So in British Columbia, these are fisheries that Indigenous folks can fish for food and ceremonial purpose, and that's separate from, commercial fishery or economic opportunity fisheries. And Andy made the good point that Indigenous access to traditional food is connected to commercial fishing. Because without commercial fishing, folks can't often afford to maintain their vessels, their gear, to fuel their boats, to fish for food and ceremonial. And so when we cut access, like happened last year, we cut so much access to commercial fishing, those harvesters weren't able to make enough money to even just maintain their boats to fish for their traditional food source. And so this is another implication of not having that basic income. So a basic income guarantee could help to ensure that Indigenous harvesters can access their traditional food, aside from commercial purposes. This is a picture of a number of our Indigenous fishermen. That's why I kind of put that up there. From we have 3 fishing families in Nunavut, and then we have Doug here's Numgeese, and then actually I can't quite see who's in that picture. It looks like Johnny, and I'm not sure who else. It's a Shot Nation fisherman. What was I going to say about this? Oh yes, so we started working with the Hunters and Trappers Association of Talogorak in Nunavut this year. They received a grant, the Northern Innovation Prize, to help build a food system to feed the most food insecure people in their community with traditionally hunted meats and fish. And I've learned a lot from them. They came down and visited us recently. We took them out on the boat. It was a fantastic experience for all of us. And they really helped me to understand how severe the poverty is in their community, and that people who would hunt and fish aren't able to because they don't even have enough money to, fuel a snowmobile and to get out there. So it made me think about how a basic income guarantee would help in those kinds of circumstances with, where they don't have support to help them get out and fish. Project Nunavut is helping the DFO, helping fisheries to meet DFO requirements to open up more Arctic char commercial fishing opportunities. And this is awesome and much needed, but without a basic income guarantee, you have kind of the same problem. People don't have the ability to afford to pursue those fisheries in the first place, and people are leaving their communities to work elsewhere and work that they don't want. Ryan talked about this, so I just had to say something also about our experience with First Nations economic opportunity fishers getting paid less than their commercial settler counterparts. And this is real. This is in Port Alberni with a lot of our harvesters as well. We see this. And Ryan mentioned this lack of infrastructure that would help out with that. Vandalism and destruction of the gear of First Nations harvesters. There are all kinds of ripple effects from, where I see hateful behavior and where I see racism coming to the surface. This all comes also out of these kinds of insecurities around income, around basic income. So I think we can't underplay how important it is to make sure that people live a basic standard of dignity in our fishing communities. So the last thing that I wanted to say is how much I think a basic income guarantee goes hand in hand with community supported fisheries. You knew I was going to get back to that, right? Because that's what I talk about. So I think that, especially for our First Nations communities, the ability of a basic income guarantee and a community supported fishery to work hand in hand to bring better economic value for First Nations harvest. So, in COVID, we saw same things that Ryan mentioned. The price of spot prawns dropped to about 1/3 of what it was the year before. But for folks who were fishing for our community supported fishery, they were paid the same or a little bit more than they were the previous year. Why? Because the end customers already bought them. They already paid for them before we went fishing. Whether the market in Asia disappeared was irrelevant, right? So a community supported fishery helps even out some of those dips and those, you know, crazy things that are beyond our control. And if you combine that with a basic income guarantee, I think you're really getting somewhere. You're really talking about decent incomes for harvesters. I've been working this year with Andy and Natasha at the Native Fishing Association. We're working on an Indigenous Women in Fishing mentorship program that I'm super excited about, and encouraging especially women, Indigenous folks, but especially Indigenous women, to start community supported fisheries in their communities. So we're working with the Shashat. There's interest from Heltsa, Kaida Gwai, and also the Northwest Indigenous Council that serves Indigenous folks who live in urban centers off reserve. So we're working with them to find ways to bring food and ceremonial fish to Indigenous folks who are off reserve and otherwise can't access, you know, when you're on reserve and they just call up and say, oh, well, there's fish, come on down on Tuesday. What happens if you're living in Vancouver? You just don't access that fish. So we're working on using the CSF model to help them build their own food system. And of course in Tilogarak as well. So those were my comments. Those are the things that it made me think of. Thank you so much for letting me speak. And I'll hand it over.
Thank you, Sonia. Okay, so next we have Rick Williams, who is the president of Praxis Research and Consulting Limited, also the research director for the Canadian Council of Fish Harvesters. He's the project director for NACOA-funded research and consultation project on labor supply and intergenerational succession challenges in the Atlantic Canada fish harvesting sector. And he's also served as deputy minister previously to the Premier for Policy and Priorities in Nova Scotia. So welcome, Rick. Yes,
why do I always have to follow her?
I guess there's one more thing really quick before you start. So we have to end at 5:45. So I'll have to kind of keep each person to 10 minutes, remaining panelists. So we might not have a lot of time for questions, but if folks at their tables, like I think you have some of those Delta conference pads or papers, like you want to write down even like a couple of key ideas or questions or insights, I'd love to collect them afterwards to hear your thoughts. Or if you have questions, then let us know. We can always connect you with the panelists separately afterwards.
Yeah, I'll try and go real quick. I really see myself providing more context for this discussion rather than really talking about basic income policies. So first slide. So those of you who were there this morning, as I suggested, there's big changes happening in our fishery that really put the whole idea of sustainability of small scale or owner operator fisheries in a new context altogether. So the first slide, the big changes are that, you know, first of all, we get climate change, we get changing species mix, a lot happening in the water and in the environment. Secondly, we've got this surging growth in this market value of seafood, which is changing the whole structure of the industry in a lot of ways. And then we've got a new policy environment in which up until 2019 with the new Fisheries Act, the fisheries and the federal Fisheries and Oceans Department had one single kind of core responsibility, and that was protecting the fish. But now with the new Fisheries Act, they are protecting the fish and they are taking into active consideration the socioeconomic benefits derived from fishery, the benefits to communities and people who work in the industry, and Aboriginal rights. So it's a new environment from a policy perspective. And then the things I touched on this morning in terms of, you know, we've got to rebuild a labor force. We've got to attract you know, basically replace about half the people currently working in the industry in Canada over the next 5, 6, 7, 8 years, or else we won't have a fishery because we won't have people to fish. So that's the context, the wider context. So specifically, what's happening with fishermen's incomes? So next slide. Yeah, and as I said, the future of that small scale or owner operator fishery is going to depend upon, we've got the policies and the regulations now, but are they enforced? Are they effectively implemented so that they achieve the objectives and so on? And the labor supply issue and new pathways to becoming owner operators in terms of the costs of enterprises and the challenge for people working in the industry as to how they can afford to become an enterprise owner. So next slide. So just I put this slide up this morning, but just give you some fairly hard numbers around what are we talking about in terms of average fishing incomes. And when I say average, this is tax filer data. Every person in Canada who earned employment incomes from 2000 to 2018, and that's the most recent year for which we have data. But it's also good because there's been chaos for the last couple of years. So this is a good base year to look at, it, 2018. So what does a fish harvester earn in Canada on average? And this population includes enterprise owners and crew, right? So it's an average. You can't separate out tax filer data. So in Newfoundland, an average income is $26,000. That's the, there's going to be a lot of people working the fishery who earn less than that because it's an average, right? And so on. And in PEI, it's 27, same ballpark, but in Nova Scotia, 38,000, much more lucrative lobster fishery there. In British Columbia, 24,000. The lowest in Canada. In the year 2000, fish harvesters in British Columbia earned the highest incomes on average in Canada, but that fishery has not enjoyed the fish harvesters, I should say, not the fishery, have not enjoyed the benefits of the growth and the value, the market value of fish for reasons we might discuss if we had opportunity. Next slide. Now here's the, in a way, more important piece, in a way, again, in terms of income security. This is total incomes for fish harvesters from all sources. So on average in Canada, fish harvesters earn half their income from fishing. And on average, they fish about 23, 24 weeks on average. Many fish much less, but much smaller numbers fish all year round. So on average, fishing provides half of fish harvester incomes in this country. Where does the rest of their income come from? The EI system is very, very important. About a fifth of income comes from EI. Non-fishing jobs, about 30% of fish harvesters in Canada earn other employment income from other jobs. And it contributes on average, but for those who do it, it contributes up to about a third of their income across the whole population. Other income is that because we have an aging population, many fish harvesters now are accessing their CPP or their OAS because they're into their 60s and so on. So that's how the fish harvesters support themselves. And in terms of the total incomes that are generated, we're basically in the $50,000 to $60,000 range. In Canada, 57.5 is the total income that people are living on. Nova Scotia, 66,000. British Columbia, 50,000. Again, a bit lower than the other areas. So that's what we're talking about in terms of the income environment. Next slide. The biggest issue there is seasonality. As I said, 27% of harvesters have 13 weeks or less of fishing. So they've got the rest of the year that they have to. So in terms of income security concerns, what do you do the rest of the year? Up until recently, we had this pattern in the Atlantic region here of what we call fishing for stamps, right? Which is that you really went fishing. It provided, quite a small part of your annual income, but you went fishing to get the stamps to get EI, because EI was your real income, right? Through the course, that carried you over the course of the year. So income security is hugely important in seasonal. Having income security programs is hugely important in the seasonal industry. I'll skip to the next. So just to say a bit more about the Fisheries EI program, up to 80% of fish harvesters in Canada qualify. And just to understand, we have the EI system overall, but we have a special Fisheries EI program that's truly unique. It is 80% of fish harvesters in Canada qualify for it. It's not based on weeks of employment, it's based on how much you earn. And the more you earn up to a certain ceiling, the more you get on benefits. So it's a fairly strong incentive to be employed and to work as much as you can, to earn as much as you can. Unlike the regular EI system, self-employed people are covered under the EI. So the enterprise owner is covered as well as their crew, right? As I say, strong incentives to work. It supports occupational pluralism quite well. I mean, i.e. working outside of your main fishing job. because you can go on and off of benefits quite easily. If you find 2 or 3 weeks of work on a fish boat over here, you can go off, go earn your employment and then go back on benefits again, and then, you know, for a couple of months, and then maybe find another job inside or outside the fishery. And it also provides Part 2 benefits, which is support for training programs to improve your career prospects, and maternity leave, and some of those other kinds of things. So it's a very, very powerful program that provides a solid income security base for the great majority of fish harvesters in Canada. And for a seasonal industry, that's really, really important. Now, there are certain, and one thing I would say on that last slide, I'm doing another study altogether that we're looking in the Atlantic region. We're looking at seasonal work overall in tourism and agriculture and other sectors. And basically we're coming, you know, we're building, I think, a pretty strong argument that the Fisheries EI program is needed in seasonal industries generally, because it works so well to incent employment. Much better welfare programs are a really serious problem in that way. But the EI program really benefits you if you work as much as you possibly can, but it covers you when you can't work because of seasonal constraints. So there are certain caveats in the long-standing debate about guaranteed annual incomes and so on, is how does it interact with the labor market? And so over the history of EI in the fishing industry, it has had perverse economic impacts in terms of in high unemployment areas with short seasons. There have been real incentives for employers to really exploit their crew because they are so dependent on that job to get the stamps, to get the EI in the winter when they're not fishing. So we have, for example, in fish plants in the Maritimes, you know, there's examples of people that would go and work there 8 or 9 weeks to get their stamps, but turn their paychecks back over to the employer. So work for nothing, slavery, in order to get that rest of the year covered in their EI. Things like that were going on. So it needs to be very, very carefully regulated and managed. Anyway, I won't go into a lot more there. But I think looming labor shortages are going to correct some of those abuses, because young people just are not interested anymore in fishing for stamps. They want more out of their careers in the industry. And the point that we've touched on here is that in areas where there's very limited, seasonally limited fisheries, or in cases like in British Columbia where you often have closures, the fishery doesn't actually happen, or it's shortened or whatever, is that we need in the industry a base security system underneath that, because of the number of people who don't qualify for EI. In British Columbia, in Newfoundland, 93% of people who fish qualify for EI. In British Columbia, it's less than 50%, because so many people have such limited access, they don't qualify. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Rick. So our next panelist is Elise Stewart, who's a labor activist and is a union organizer with FFAW-Unifor. She's provided media commentary, public presentations, guest lectures on labor activism, decent work, and progressive policy initiatives. She was chair of Common Front Newfoundland Labrador, Coalition of Labor, Social Justice, students and community organizations, which launched the 15 and Fairness movement in the province. And more recently, she served on the steering committee for the Workers' Action Network. So thank you. And I think your slides should be, okay, sorry, I didn't.
Oh, that is a-okay. I'll go over here. I feel like there might be animations that I was also a teacher, so like this gonna come out, yeah. Like there might be some animations.
So I don't know how many clicks.
Can I click?
Oh.
Does that make sense? Just 11th hour technology changes right now.
Yeah.
Just to spice it up, just to see what's going to happen. Okay, yeah, click. There could be a lot of clicks. Yeah, click again. Wicked. Yeah, folks, can everybody hear me in the back? I have a very loud voice. And yeah, I'm getting a lot of nods. Too loud sometimes. We'll deal with that later. So I am with FFAW-Unifor. We are the union that represents all inshore harvesters, owner-operators in this province. And what has been spoken about a lot is that we represent a lot of plant workers. So the fishing industry is not just about the harvesters, but it's about those plant workers that are essential in doing value-added resources in this province, which is what we want to keep folks here and to keep as much our communities alive as possible. So as Kristen said, I've done a lot of decent work advocacy in the province. I was the chair of 15 in Fairness for a very long time. We actually launched in 2018 with a $15 minimum wage. And in 2023, we are probably going to get it. So 5 years. And that took a lot of work to get what seems like little just breadcrumbs. But that's what's happening when you're challenging very large systems. Next slide. Yes. So there's a really important thing that I wanted to preface in how we frame any conversation about workers and about basic income and about EI, which I'm going to talk a lot about as well, which is that the work is seasonal, not the workers. So a lot of times there is a myth that these workers don't want to work. You know, they want to take time off. They just want to go for a little bit and take time off. A worker in Newfoundland and Labrador and in most fishing communities would work 52 weeks a year if they could, but that is not what the season will allow. So it is not that the workers are seasonal, it's that the work is seasonal. In Newfoundland and Labrador, you folks have probably heard a lot about, we have demographic realities, which is that we have a shrinking and aging population. So it is not going well in that respect for our population, which means that a lot of our industries, not just the fishing industry, across the board, every sector has to deal with these labor shortages. And how do we do that? Very complicated. So despite the growth in multi-species enterprises in Newfoundland and Labrador in particular, so Tony might have talked about, we are doing snow crab, there is cod, there is turbot. It's trying to extend the season as long as possible, not just for harvesters, but also, again, for plant workers. Because in communities like Port Choix, in communities like the Beatha plant, it is exactly the case that you have a person that fishes on the water, and then you have a person that is working in the plant, and they're all in the same family. And it is essential that it's a community-focused approach. So we are still struggling to get enough to get EI. So Rick mentioned about stamps. We call it 14 weeks. So for plant workers, we want those good 14. So as many hours as you can possibly work in that 14 weeks is essential in lasting you for the rest of the year. A lot of our plant workers are over the age of 55. Most are women. They are unable to work that 14 weeks a lot of time due to a lot of crab asthma, a lot of these different issues. So that is becoming more difficult every single year to get to that 14 weeks. However, that's the way EI works now. So that's kind of what we're stuck with. The fishing industry and rural communities are deeply integrated with EI. So Rick, I was really happy that Rick went first because I was like, I need his numbers. So the numbers are the fishing industry and EI are related. They are intertwined, especially in rural Newfoundland and Labrador. There is nowhere else to work, right? It's the plant, it's the water, that's it. There might be at Tim Hortons an hour away, maybe there's not. So there is no other jobs for folks to go to. It is totally dependent on the fishing industry. So a worker-centered approach to public policy is essential in designing a system that includes basic income that can be responsive, inclusive, and robust. Next slide. So in my work with Unifor, so Unifor is the national, like the big umbrella union that FFAW is a part of. So we have been working since, I would say, since the beginning of COVID-19 to fix EI. We knew it was very broken. We did not need a pandemic to tell us that because I answer calls every single day from a worker that is 1 week away from not getting enough to survive the rest of the year. That is one haul away from not being able to survive the rest of the year. So we already knew that it was very, very bad. And then COVID-19 happened and it collapsed what was a very weak system anyway. So we had 40% of workers in this country that were not covered by EI, a system that is supposed to be universal. So what do? We had the CERB for a bit. That was, it was a measure, but it was not a permanent fix. So this last year, especially, we did a full campaign called Build Back Better EI. We focused on reforming and modernizing the EI system. So take what we have and see how we can fix it to make it better. We talked about expanding eligibility criteria. Fun fact that's not fun at all, a lot of folks that were on EI and the pandemic happened and were on their maternity benefits and came back to a job that didn't exist, they got no money despite having new children. Disgusting and awful, and it's still the case. So you can't combine benefits. So if I'm on EI, I get laid off, maternity, and they max out. So we talk about expanding the criteria, going to 106 weeks of benefits, going to 52 weeks of benefits, increasing the amount that you receive. So right now, an EI claim is $638 before tax. Before tax is a really important thing to say because after tax, it is not very much money. So you're receiving about $15.60 on a 40-hour work week with EI maxed out. That's if you can get max benefits, which does not often happen. So that is not enough to live on. It is enough to kind of get you to the next season or to get you to the next job. So we want to increase those benefits. The clawback right now is $60,300. So once you earn beyond that, then you start to get clawbacks kind of dollar for dollar. Same thing goes with working while on claim. If a person is in a plant and a week of work pops up, but they're on their regular claims, it makes no sense to go and work because you're paying the employer to be there. So it just doesn't work. Responsive to economic, population, and climate emergencies. This is not the first time you're going to hear this. COVID-19 is not the last awful, terrible thing that's going to happen to our population. It's just the most recent one that happened to a lot of folks. So we need to have a system that is responsive to climate emergencies, responsive to people not being able to fish for a season. I talked to a lot of folks in BC last year when this was happening, and they were like, yeah, we can't even get to that minimum threshold point. And that's a problem because it's beyond your control. You can't control the weather or the seasons, though I'm sure we wish we could sometimes. And we want it to be easier to use. This seems very simple. Isn't EI easy? It's not. It's very hard. It's a system that is cumbersome and it's a lot to go through. Again, I'm walking people through it like a Service Canada agent many days, and it doesn't make sense. So it needs to be responsive because you need to access that money and those supports quickly. Next slide, which I hope is my last, but I don't know. Making the argument. These are some myths. I would say press 4 times. Yeah, it is 4 times. That was good. So these are myths that you folks are going to hear all the time. Raise your hand if you've heard any of these myths. Basic income or more accessible unemployment insurance, it's going to hurt the labor market. The CERB program was the reason so many workplaces could not get workers. Yeah, I better see everybody saying, I was on the radio all the time. All workers want in the fishery is just to earn enough to get EI and then they're gone. Yep. And we can't afford all these handouts. Love that one, hear it all the time. We cannot afford to not support people in this country to live and thrive here. We are losing every minute that we do not create systems that are responsive to the needs of workers and the people that live here. I believe I have one more. Sorry. Kristen, you're so intimidating over there with your clock. Next slide, please. All right, getting it right for workers. This has to be, back to my first slide, any system that we create that is federally regulated or provincially regulated has to be responsive to the people that it is trying to help. And again, that seems very basic, that we should create systems that are for workers when they're supposed to help them. That is not the case. They are created a top-down approach. They do not come from the bottom, from those people that need it the most. A worker-centered approach that does not penalize workers for going to work when that work is available is also important in any basic income system that we have. EI is not the solution. Believe me, I know. And it is what we have right now. And I think we can learn from the failures of this system and also how we're trying to make it better, what basic income could look like. Thank you. I was going a little bit over. A little bit over.
Fabulous. I'm sorry to make you speak so quickly. So we have one panelist remaining who should be on joining us virtually. So Chelsea Kook-Marche is our last panelist. She is the mayor of Port-au-Port, West-Aguathuna-Felix Cove. She's a fisher person, married into a fishing family. So she's been involved with the fishery for about 20 years now. As a full-time fisher. They recently started their first year, herself and her husband, as enterprise owners. They're fishing lobster, crab, groundfish. What else can I say? She also she welcomes visitors to their town. So as on the West Coast, has the oldest wooden church in Atlantic Canada, a museum and craft shop, walking trails, and beautiful scenery. So if you haven't been there, it sounds like a great place to visit. So we'll start with Chelsea's. Hopefully you can hear us, Chelsea.
Yes, yeah. Hi.
Great.
Thank you for having me. I just wanted to share my experience as a fisher person here on the West Coast. I just want to share a bit of my story and why I think that basic income would work for families such as myself. I moved to Newfoundland in the year 2000. And I moved here from Alberta, so I grew up on a farm, and I married into a fishing family, and I've been involved with the fishery for about 20 years. We have been working towards receiving or buying our own enterprise for the past 5 years. The way that the legislation and the regulations is that you have to have 75% of your earnings come from the fishery in order to buy a license. Because we are a young family, it was really hard. We worked really hard. We had to budget a lot. We had to really watch what we're spending and stuff in order to save up to buy an enterprise. So this is our first year as enterprise owners. So we got our new boat, we got our new motor, and then we made t-shirts for all our crew and our family because we were so excited and to finally become enterprise owners. However, now we have the debt, but but we did work really hard. With us, we have 2 small children. And of course, during this time, we decided that we were going to start our family. And again, because of the regulations that 75% of your earnings had to come from the fishery, we were pretty boxed in. You really can't raise a family on a helper's license. Thankfully, we had a lot of motivation. Another thing that I believe that will help too is in the form of childcare. We have a village that helps us with our 2 small children. And thankfully, we do have some family members that help. In previous years, accessing daycare was one of our options that we had to do. Because we are considered seasonal, we had to actually put our children in for a full year of daycare. And so again, a basic income would help pay for those costs too as well. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you a little story about my father-in-law. A lot of the people who are there in the room from the FFAW actually probably more than likely have heard of my in-laws, Peter March and Eleanor March. They've been fishing here from Felix Cove for years. Peter just gave up last year after 58 years, so we took over the enterprise. But he bought his fishing license when he was 14 years old for 25 cents. And now, of course, the price of fishing license now is way more than 25 cents. But they raised 4 children together. He fished for 58 years. His mother fished for 38 years. She was also involved with working in the plants too early on in her career as well. And they struggled and they basically had to, in the early years, because of the price and working for, to make their EI. But it's changed a lot since then. And hopefully my hope is that it will change for us and our family going forward, because when you fish, you're not guaranteed your catch. And you're not guaranteed the prices, but you are guaranteed of the love of the water. And we're out there every day during the season and we love it during good and bad weather. And my husband, Colin, he's 3rd generation fisherman, and you can't get him off the water. Yeah, so that's my story. I just thought I'd just quickly share at the end of our season this year, because as I said, we've worked really hard to gain an enterprise, that we're gonna have we're gonna get out more shirts for our family and our crew, and we're gonna have a little lobster boil, because it's a struggle. But if for us, it's something that we love to do, and and we're raising our children, and with a love for the fishery too. And I really wish that the more younger harvesters will get up and speak out too as well. Thank you.
So I think that's a great way to sort of a great note to sort of wrap this up with. There are 4 minutes. I don't know if there are any really pressing questions that somebody wants to ask. If you also want to leave any notes at your table, like questions, comments, thoughts, I'd love to read those afterwards. Any one quick or burning question before we? Barb, yes. Or comment?
So basically, somewhere in shifting to basic income, assuming BI continues, right? It doesn't change. So should the focus be BI better? There's lots of people still home, or folks.
Thanks for the easy question, Barb. No, I mean, I think that what we're trying to do right now is make sure